I'm Lance Lambert. Thanks for tuning into the Vintage Vehicle Show. We're in Oceanside, California at Jim Wangers Warehouse. Jim Wangers is known far and wide as the godfather of the GTO. If you enjoy those great muscle cars from the 1960s, this is one of the people that you have to say thank you to. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to say thank you to him because he's right over here. We're going to meet him. Jim, thank you very much for inviting us into your collection here. This is very impressive.
Well, Lance, it's always a pleasure to have a knowledgeable car guy come in and
we'll just see how knowledgeable I am here today. You were on our show probably about 2 years ago at a Pontiac show, and of course I knew of you by reputation, had seen your work and had admired it all, but the thing that struck me was at that show there was sort of a hushed reverie whenever you were around. It's like, that's Jim Wangers.
You're kind.
Yeah, you were definitely the star of the show at that.
I'm one of those guys who was lucky enough to have been there, you know, at the right place at the right time, working with the right people. And I like to share all that, you know. I figure if I can tell somebody one thing about their car or about the era or even one of the competitive cars, you know, it's worthwhile. And frankly, I enjoy it.
You were kind enough to share with me one of your editions of your Glory Days book, which was a can't put down read. It was really, really interesting. I didn't realize how much you had your hands on everything GTO and an awful lot Pontiac, and then beyond that. How did that all start?
Well, I was lucky enough, as I said, to have gotten to Detroit right about that time when you know, this was maybe about 7 or 8 years before the baby boomers matured into a significant buying segment. And actually, my first days in this area of activity was with Chevrolet. I was lucky enough to be at Chevrolet actually working for their ad agency in 1955 when they introduced their first modern V8, you know, the little turbo fire. And we got involved in racing. It was the first time that Chevrolet really got seriously involved with NASCAR. I moved on from Chevrolet to Chrysler and was lucky enough to be at Chrysler at the time that they, in fact, really invented the muscle car, even though they weren't quite sure themselves what they had done, when that was with the appearance of the first Chrysler 300, 1955 too. By 1956, they had the Plymouth Fury. Dodge had a version of it called the D500.
Things were happening.
And the interesting thing about it is they were about 10 years ahead of their time by taking a packaged performance car, and that's the key word. They were smart enough to package. They put the big engine in those days. Of course, it was the big Hemi, and that little New Yorker coupe wasn't really little, but it was one of the smaller versions of their car, and created kind of a performance package, and it worked. They did the same thing with the DeSoto. They called it the Adventurer, the Dodge D500. Then came the Plymouth Fury, and they really were on their way about 7 or 8 years before that market was ready. Well, their management didn't appreciate and didn't recognize what they had, and they decided, no, these are two good names, 300, Fury, D500, so they extended them to a series of cars. Suddenly we had a Plymouth Fury station wagon or a Chrysler 300 four-door sedan, and of course that was, in a sense, kind of spitting right in the eye of the neat little image that they had stumbled into by coming about packaging these nice performance cars in a good-looking little sporty coupe. Well, I protested so loudly, pleaded with those guys, you know, don't give up what you got, that instead of their listening to me, they suggested maybe I might like to work someplace else. So they broomed me out of there, and that was just about the time that Pontiac was getting started. A guy by the name of Bunky Dudson had already taken over Pontiac. He had committed to saying we're going to turn Grandma into a teenager.
You and Bunky were friends, right?
Well, I wasn't until I met him.
Okay.
When I read what he said he was going to do, I said, hey, they need me.
And did they know that?
Well, they didn't know it until I went over and pounded on their doors and pounded on their doors, and finally they put me at the ad agency. Didn't actually bring me into Pontiac.
Was that to, oh, this guy's really kind of a bother, I kind of like his idea, let's put him over here and see what he does? Or did they go, wow, you've really got something, go make it happen?
Well, what how it first started out really with Bunky is he said that I like this guy's thinking. He's got something to tell us, but we don't necessarily need to put him in our own organization. If he's functioning from the outside, maybe he might be able to get a little bit more done. Now, the guy who really picked up on that was John DeLorean,
right,
who later then became the general manager of the division.
And he had a lot of faith in what you were talking
about,
right?
John had sort of watched us mature and grow together, and his philosophy was that if we come up with some good ideas or some pretty good promotions, we don't need to get them into the organization and stumble trying to sell everybody in the organization and prove that it's going to work and do research. He
was a courageous guy.
Get them outside the agency. We can get stuff done. I know how we can budget for it, and it worked. That really, really made it easy to do a lot of the neat things that we ultimately ended up doing.
Did the top tier at General Motors, were they really in the dark what you were doing, and then the next level or two down, they pretended they were in the dark but knew it was a good thing, or were they, how, it doesn't seem like something like this can be kept under wraps very well, but was it?
I can honestly answer your question by saying yes. The very top tier never slowed down long enough to kind of figure it out. Yes, some of the competitors figured it out, but they didn't know what to do about it. They didn't really have such an organization, the idea. And at that particular time, and I think this is important, the automotive enthusiast press in the early 60s was kind of an outlaw activity. I'm talking about some of the really well-known magazines like Hot Rod and Carcraft and Motor Trend and even Car and Driver at that time. And there wasn't the kind of respect at the marketing level within the auto industry that there certainly is today and that there should have been, except at Pontiac, where we knew this is where the heart of our market was. And these were the people that, that believed what they read in these magazines. And so we began to spend a lot of money with these magazines. We bought a lot of advertising, and at the same time we supported that with a lot of good running cars.
Mm-hmm. Jim, a red GTO convertible. Does it get any better than this?
That's just what I was going to say. It doesn't get any better than that. You really don't have to say much more than that. This is really, in a sense, kind of the quintessential GTO. This was the car they wrote songs about. This was the car that kids
GTO.
were dancing in the street. Exactly. This was the car that had the famous tri-power option. Of course, the fact that it was red and the fact that it's a convertible, that just all adds up to the appeal and the attraction. And I got to say that one of the things that was very significant in the early 60s, really throughout most of the 60s period, is that we were building proportionately a lot more convertibles than we are even in today's market. And the reason for that is that in those days we didn't have a unit construction car. We had a body on chassis, and it was relatively easy to take the regular chassis and build the extra support, the extra bracing in the side rails, and particularly of the conventional chassis, and be able to put a convertible on it by simply taking the top off. Whereas if you had a unit construction car, that became a whole lot more complicated.
Yeah.
When they went to the unit, the convertibles got pretty expensive.
Jim, when I walked into your warehouse here, beautiful cars, but this bright orange, "Here Come the Judge," jumped out at me. What a spectacular looking car.
Well, I like to think so. This is absolutely, without any question, my favorite Pontiac, and of course my favorite GTO. So much so that it is really the featured car in my new book, Pontiac Pizzazz, where I spell out, in answer to really hundreds of requests from all of the Pontiac hobby everywhere, what's your favorite Pontiac? And I can answer them without a moment hesitation. Needless to say, this car is the highlight of the book because it is the highlight of my GTO experience. Now, it's interesting that you should say, "Here comes the judge," because that is, in fact, the expression that gave, actually brought forth the name of the car.
What came first, Sammy Davis Jr. or the car?
Absolutely Sammy Davis Jr. In fact, the name of the car, again, is credited to John DeLorean, who at that time was a very big fan of the Laugh-In show, and particularly that incident every week when they would come on and say, "Here come the judge, here come the judge." And I remember DeLorean telling us, they're screaming, they're about the judge, they're going to bring you the judge, let's bring them a judge. And that's how the car got its name. And of course, the car itself was that kind of a car. When we got into the development of this car, and this is in 1969, by now the muscle car era had really reached its peak and was starting to kind of tail off a little bit. The emission guys were beginning to be heard. The safety guys were coming in and making a few. By those guys, I'm talking the government, were coming in. The insurance guys were beginning to catch on. We were running into a little flack on the whole concept of a muscle car. So what we decided to do was to kind of hype the whole muscle car image at Pontiac, which was the GTO, of course. So the Judge was created as a kind of a special model of the GTO. And given that name, what we were doing in effect is sort of laughing at or spoofing the whole concept of what a muscle car was all about. First of all, to paint it in this perfectly, ridiculous. Bear in mind, now this is 1968, an absolutely ridiculous orange car. We put a pop art stripe on the side of the car. We put the name of the car in pop art. Who had ever done anything like
Peter
that?
Max look there, yeah.
And we put a spoiler on the car, a 2-inch stand-up spoiler. That was outrageous. But one of the things that was consistent about the Judge is we only offered it with 2 engines. The Ram Air, which we call the Ram Air 3, simply because of the nomenclature of the development of it, was the standard engine. And the only option available in the car was the Ram Air 4.
The hood tack, was that specific to the Judges, or was that available in all the GTOs?
No, that was a Pontiac development. Actually, it was available on all of the Pontiacs. It was originally introduced, and we'll get a chance to look at this car, on the '67 Firebird. That's when it first came out. Back in those days, nobody really knew, unless you were really a or an engineer, what the hell a tachometer was all about, what it measures, and except that guys who had tachometers were really tuned in guys.
My lowered 54 Olds 88 had a big disco tack on the steering column that wasn't even wired in, but it was cool.
It was there, and you were bragging about it. Well, here you had an opportunity to drive around and show the world that you knew what a tachometer is.
One of the things that's so cool about a lot of muscle cars, and especially this Judge, is the hood scoops. They just scream of, I'm powerful, I need these nostrils to flare so I can perform.
Well, that's interesting you should bring that up. That has always been a real signature feature on a GTO. And even as Pontiac got involved with their Firebird, the 400, the best running Firebird always had a hood scoop, as did the Trans Am. On the other hand, back in the earlier days, in the 65s and all the way on up really through the 69 and 70, if you were to look for the dumbest place on the hood to put a functioning hood scoop, you couldn't really find it any worse than this. Even though they looked great and they were packaged in a beautiful styling form, they really didn't work, because as the air came up off the leading edge of the hood, the faster the vehicle went, the more the air would rise. And the faster you got, in effect, you really created almost a vacuum here, because the air was up here, it would hit the windshield, kind of swirl around, and then get sort of sucked back, which is why the rear intake systems,
the cowl hoods,
the cowl induction hood that one of our competitors, I'll call them what they are, Chevrolet, came up with that, and God bless them. Pontiac later went to it with the use of their shaker hood on the Trans Am, but that became the most functional way to get fresh air, other than to bring, as some of the cars did, the actual hood scoop right up here on the leading edge of the hood.
Didn't quite look right.
It didn't look right. No question about it.
I love the Firebirds. I love '67 Firebirds. I like this Firebird.
Well, you couldn't have said it any better. This, of course, is significant for a lot of reasons. This is the first Firebird. The story of the Firebird, could be the subject of this whole show, really, but I'll give it to you really quickly. Pontiac did not want to build a Firebird, and John DeLorean in particular, after trying on several occasions to get a car of his own approved, a little sporty car that he had been working on. It was called the Banshee. That's another whole story, really. But the corporation finally said to him, you know, quit fooling around. You're going to build a Firebird. And we want it to be out in the marketplace no more than 6 months after the Chevrolet, the Camaro, which, if you remember, was about 3 years late getting into the marketplace after the Mustang. And this really, while everybody kind of loosely refers to them as muscle cars, they are not muscle cars. These are really called pony cars. And that name pony is really out of respect for the Mustang, who did indeed, just as the GTO did kind of invent the muscle car, the Mustang invented the pony car. And Chevrolet, they finally got around to building their answer to the pony car with the Camaro, and Pontiac followed it. Well, now the most significant thing about the Pontiac, John DeLorean, again, as the head of the division, said, the last thing I'm going to do, and he was talking to this General Motors management, is build a Camaro with a split grill and call it a Pontiac. And he said, if you're going to make me build a step-up car, I want a step-up engine. And he went downtown and talked to the right people and pounded on a few desks and put a whole bunch of figures and facts in front of them. And the reason I'm as knowledgeable about it is because I prepared the presentation really for him. And he was able to convince General Motors that in order for Pontiac to succeed with a car very much like the Camaro, it had to have a bigger engine. And at the time, when the Firebird was announced with the 400 cubic inch engine, because the biggest engine you could get in the Chevrolet, when it first came out, was a 327. Then they quickly went to the 350. But for a 400-inch engine in a car this size, you know, that was mind-blowing. And of course, it really had a lot to do. This is the first Pontiac Firebird, not the, but I mean this was the first year, the 67 Firebird 400. Another very interesting thing, which is important I think to know, is that with the introduction of this car, which was mid-year after the Camaro was out, Pontiac introduced this new color, which was called Verdoro Green. And at that time, greens were just an absolute no-no in the marketplace. Nobody wanted anything to do with a green. It was a military color. It looked a little bit like an army camouflage.
It kind of holds true now. I know some of the old collector cars that go on for sale, sometimes a red one will get 10 grand more than a green one, but otherwise they're the same car, well, if it's the wrong green.
And that's pretty true, except if you're a Pontiac. And if you're a Pontiac in Verdoro Green, that's automatically an association that the market loves, and particularly the Pontiac enthusiasts. Now, the story of this color is worth taking a few minutes to talk about. It comes actually from John DeLorean's wife, who, while at a party in her neighborhood, she noticed an ashtray, which was this kind of an interesting looking green. She talked the hostess out of the ashtray, and then she gave it to John and said, John, why don't you build a sporty Pontiac in this color? So John, kind of, just going along with her and patronizing her, he called in the Pittsburgh paint people, who were the big suppliers for GM, and gave them this ashtray. And he says, can you guys do something with this? He said, mostly out of just being nice to his wife. About 30 days later, they came back with this incredible color. They had taken some gold metal fleck, put it in that kind of a shade of green that ashtray was. It was actually a Mexican heritage. It came from Mexico. And they developed this car, and it was the kind of thing you looked at and you said, my God, it works. This really is nice. So we introduced this 67 Firebird mid-year in this color, at least initially. It was available in all the colors, just like I said with the Judge. We ended up selling over 30% of all Firebirds were built in 1967
in that color.
In this color, Verdoro Green.
You have several other GTOs and various Pontiacs in the room here. You're going for the significant ones that are very significant to you, or what are you accomplishing with your collection here?
Well, I created, in my own mind what I thought were, and everywhere I used to go, I constantly am asked, hey Jim, what's your favorite Pontiac, or what's your favorite GTO, And I got to thinking, I have a favorite, but it's for, in many ways, a very specific reason, and not necessarily because the product itself was so outstanding. And a lot of it had to do with my particular involvement with it. My favorite GTO, my favorite Pontiac is the Judge. It will always be. But one of the reasons that it's the Judge is because I had quite a bit to do with the development of it, but more importantly, I had just about all to do with convincing Pontiac that they should build it.
Was John DeLorean a pretty good guy? I mean, somebody fun to hang out and have a beer with, or was he all business?
And one of the most complete guys you'd ever want to work with. He was not only an engineer, he made it a point of understanding production engineering, what it took to take a car out of the engineering laboratory and put it on the assembly line. And that's a huge task, and one which is so often overlooked as being such an important part of our business. And then when John, as chief engineer, realized that he was in a pretty good position to go on and become the general manager of the division at that time, he was smart enough to realize that he didn't really understand a whole lot about advertising and marketing and promotion. And so he went to the right places and sought out the right kind of help and made himself a good marketing guy. So, and that helped me tremendously, because when he did get in charge and he was in a position to make decisions, he understood what we were trying to do and understood some of the, like the Judge, for example, and became supportive of it.
Must have been really exciting working with a real car guy.
Well, it was. It was on more than one occasion, I have to tell you. I'd go in there with a major presentation, like some of our really weird promotions, like the Monkey Mobile, or like this great Cheeto Tiger promotion where we actually had demo drives on the drag strip, allowed people to drive a car down the drag strip against another one with a guy dressed up in a tiger suit. Outrageous things that we were able to do because he understood it.
You talked about out of the box. Well, in the not too distant past, out of a box, arriving at my front door was a copy of Glory Days, your book on just kind of everything we're talking about. I thought that, well, I knew I had tons to learn about Pontiacs, but this really was, I couldn't put it down kind of read. There was so many neat stories in here and stuff about DeLorean.
Very kind of you. I appreciate that.
It was great. This just came out, Pontiac Pizzazz. You talked about the Monkey Mobile. There's pictures in here. I made reference to the artwork. There's really good examples. I mean, the example, the Fitz work that's in here.
Well, I was so lucky to be able to have that resource available. As I said, this book came about really from requests that I would get everywhere. What's your favorite Pontiac? So I decided to put a book together of what I thought were the 15 most important and most significant Pontiacs.
Trans Ams refer to cars all over the world in various categories, but when somebody says Trans Am, I think everybody's mind immediately goes to not to a series of races or a foreign car, they go to a Pontiac.
Well, you're absolutely right. And the Trans Am, interestingly enough, kind of came into its own after the death of the GTO, really after the so-called muscle car era. It got literally reinvented. This goes back into the early to mid 70s when the fuel situation that we were going through kind of solved itself and people weren't worried about their next gallon of gasoline, and suddenly they began to get interested in performance again. Pontiac now had the Firebird to work with, so they developed a super Firebird, in a sense, just exactly what the GTO was. It was kind of a super Tempest or a super Le Mans. And by developing the Trans Am and allowing it to grow as it did so successfully, in the year 1978, for example, we sold over 100,000 just Trans Ams, plus an additional 100,000 Firebirds. And one of the things that really made that Trans Am, and I might add, it's a real serious feature car in my new book, Pontiac Pizzazz, because it is unquestionably, though not my favorite, the most popular, well-known Pontiac of all time, and that's the Bandit. And that, of course, was
Burt
because of
Reynolds.
that magnificent film, Smokey and the Bandit, and thanks to the efforts of Burt Reynolds and Sally Field and Jackie Gleason and a few more really well-known Hollywood personalities. Without a doubt, in my opinion, the best movie presentation of a car, where a car, in a sense, became a star. Every time that movie ran, or when they got it on television, it used to run on the Sunday night CBS movie, or the CBS Sunday night movie. We could measure traffic in the showrooms the next couple of days of literally people coming in looking for a black and gold Trans Am, which is why we carried the car from 77 to 78 to 79, even into 80.
I'd like the opportunity to maybe drive a car of yours that you stated is your favorite, and I think it's my favorite in the room. You think I can end the show with a little drive in
I
that,
can't think
in
of
that
anything
Judge?
I'd like better, really.
all
I'll put
right.
you behind the wheel of my favorite GTO, the Judge.
Okay.
A Ram Air Judge.
Okay. Well, here comes Lance in the Judge. Jim, thank you very much for allowing us to be your guest here today.
Lance, it's been a real pleasure, and I want you to enjoy driving this car, and anybody else that wants to enjoy these cars, tune in on my website,
Which is?
GTOtiger.com.
GTOtiger.com. And I'll have this back probably sometime in the fall, early winter. Is that okay?
Well, you'll have no trouble getting somebody that wants to show you how fast it is.
Yeah, I'll make a lot of new friends with this. Thanks, Jim. Bye-bye.